Once upon a time there was a sweet little girl who lived with her father and mother near her grandmother, who lived in the wood, made her a pretty red cloak with a hood. When the little girl wore it, she looked so bright and gay that everybody called her Little Red Riding Hood. One day, Little Red Riding Hood's mother said to her, "I have just heard that your grandmother is sick in bed. I am worried about her because she is all alone. I will fix a basket of cakes and broth and some goodies, and you can take them to her." Little Red Riding Hood was so glad to go, for she did not have a chance to see her grandmother very often. She waited while her mother put bread and butter and some custard and broth and some jellies into the basket and covered them with a clean white cloth. Then she put on her red cloak and hood, took the basket over one arm, and off she went at once. Her mother had warned her not to be careful and to stay on the path. By and by she came to a glade in the forest where the loveliest flowers grew. Baby rabbits and chipmunks scurried about. Little Red Riding Hood had never seen so beautiful a spot. Just then a shadow fell across the glade. Out from the trees came a big wolf. Little Red Riding Hood was frightened and turned to run away. But the wolf asked in such a kind voice, "What is your name, little girl? Have you lost your way?" And so she was quite put at ease. "My name is Little Red Riding Hood, and I am not lost," she said. "I'm going to visit my grandmother to take her this basket of provisions." "What a thoughtful little girl you are, to be sure," said the wolf. "Tell me, does your grandmother live far from here?" "Oh, she lives just in our first white cottage on the other side of the wood." "Why don't you pick some of these pretty flowers and take them to your grandmother?" asked the wolf. "Yes, she would like that," said Little Red Riding Hood, and she began to pick the pretty flowers. Meanwhile, the cunning wolf took off through the woods. He intended to get to grandmother's home and eat her up before Little Red Riding Hood arrived. He went up the path and soon came to the white cottage. He knocked gently on the door, tap, tap, tap. "Who is there?" cried grandmother from her bed. "It is I, Little Red Riding Hood," answered the wolf, making his voice sound so much like the little girl's. "I have brought you some custard and broth from Mother. Pull the bobbin, lift the latch, and walk in," said grandmother. The wolf pulled the bobbin, the latch flew up, and he went into the grandmother's cottage. He stepped closer to the bed and bounded over to eat up the poor old woman. Almost too late, she saw that it was not Little Red Riding Hood. The poor old grandmother was greatly frightened, but she gathered all of her strength and making one leap out of bed, she ran straight across the room to the closet door. She just managed to shut the door and lock it as the wolf jumped there. The wolf thought that if he could not have the grandmother, at least he could have the little girl. He found one of grandmother's caps and a nightgown and put them on. Then he got into bed, pulled the covers up under his chin and waited. In a few minutes, Little Red Riding Hood came along the path and knocked at the cottage door. From the bed, the wolf called out, making his voice as soft as possible, "I am in bed, child. I can't get up. Lift up the latch, my dear, and come in." Little Red Riding Hood entered the cottage and came near the bed. Instead of kissing her grandmother and asking her how she felt, Red Riding Hood cried out in a startled voice, "Why, grandmother, what big arms you have! The better to hug you with, my dear." And the wolf said in his disguised voice, "Grandmother, what great ears you've got! The better to hear you with, my dear." "Grandmother, what great eyes you've got! All the better to see you with, my dear." "Grandmamma, what great teeth you've got! All the better to gobble you up with, my dear," cried the wolf. The wolf threw back the bedclothes and with his mouth opened wide, made one big spring at Little Red Riding Hood. She screamed so loudly that a woodman near happened to hear her voice as he was passing by. He picked up his gun and ran as fast as he could towards the cottage. The woodman aimed squarely and shot the wolf through the heart. "Do not be frightened, little girl," said the woodman. "You are safe now, and I was very lucky that I happened to be passing by and heard your cry for help." Little Red Riding Hood still could not understand how her dear grandmother had turned into a wicked wolf. And when she tried to ask the woodman about it, he shook his head. He was afraid to tell her that he thought the wolf had eaten her grandmother. He felt sorry for her. Just then they heard a faint sound in the cupboard. It was the grandmother who had heard the sound of the shot. The woodman sprang to help her and carried her back to bed. The brave woodman stayed to eat supper with them, and they were all fast friends forever after. In fact, the woodman went to live in the little white cottage on the other side of the road of the wood, so that the grandmother did not have to live alone any more.
That's all, folks.
We are the knights who say...